Hey everybody, this is the second section of uh, the chapter Trace Reading of a Beginning in part 3 of Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's book Western Marxism and Introduction. Part 3 of the book is titled Theory or General Trace Reading. The last section that we read was titled Traditional Foundations. This section will be titled Ens Rationis. So here we go. In other words, quote, in political economy, the task is to turn the theory of property against property itself, specifically to bring about that which they, parenthesis, the German socialists, and parenthesis, call, quote, community of goods, end quote. Communauté. I don't know what that means. In which I, for the moment, content myself with calling, quote, freedom and, quote, equality, end quote. Footnote: Letter from Proudhon to Marx, dated 1844, cited in Arthur Mühlberger's Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, published in Freiburg, 1979. And footnote. Quote, when the proletariat says to the wealthy class, just as you have conquered power and property, so too do we wish to become sovereigns and proprietors. What is it demanding, if not the extension, down to its own ranks, of a lineage that begins with the king, passes through the nobility and the clergy, and continues through the bourgeoisie or industrial feudalism, end quote. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, in De la création de l'ordre dans l'humanité, ou principe de organisation politique. And there's no translation of that, but let's guess it's the creation of the order of humanity, or principles of political organization. I don't know. 1843. See regarding the critical engagement with Proudhon, Helmut Brentel's book Soziale Form und ökonomisches Objekt, Studien zum Gegenstands- und Methodenverständnis der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, and Nadja Rakowitz's Einfache Warenproduktion, Ideal und Ideologie. Neither of these interpretations examines the evident relationship to Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte, who, with respect to the concept of order, thus the question persists, which order, or indeed order at all? Question mark. The tension inherent in the concept of property points to an unbroken bourgeois ethos. Another approach presents itself as more enlightened than those that orient themselves solely by the advanced state of technology. In his study, Jacques Bidet seeks a universal principle that must be presupposed above all else. Footnote. See Jacques Bidet, Que faire du capital, Matériaux pour une refondation, published in Paris, 1985. I think that's translated as Exploring Marx's Capital. I can't remember. Or Investigating Marx's Capital. I think it's Exploring, though. Footnote. This volume, this book by Jacques Bidet, offers many interesting aspects. However, here, only one line of argument is highlighted. It is a shortcoming of Jan Hoff's study that it provides an overview of, rather than an insight into, the theoretical discussion within non-German Marxism. See Hoff's Marx Worldwide, which is on this channel. See correspondingly the sections concerning the French discussion, which focus exclusively on Althusser. See, by contrast, the essay by Lindner, which is more advanced in its approach regarding the reception of Marx in France. See Kolja Lindner, Die Editionsgeschichte der Werke von Marx und Engels in Frankreich und ihr Neubeginn mit der Grande Edition Marx et Engels. In GEM, parenthesis, GEME, in parenthesis. In Marx Engels Jahrbuch 2008. End footnote. Jacques Bidet argues that all categories of Marx's work must always be understood a priori as simultaneously political and economic. The various conceptual drafts are understood as successive and mutually superseding discourses, which allow the drafts to be grouped into a series. In this process, however, the categories are grouped according to a mechanistic analogy. The conceptual structure thereby acquires a polar character, a feature that becomes evident in the subsequent exposition. End footnote. This approach, Bidet's approach, that all categories of Marx's work must always be understood a priori as simultaneously political and economic, operates on the assumption that the Marxian framework unfolds from a universal principle, specifically a theory of the capitalist mode of production. The very schematism of Bidet's exposition appears to lead Bidet to assume that it is necessary to supply, as something ultimately lacking in Marx, that, quote, absolute universal, end quote, which is requisite in a rationalist system. A universal intended to serve as the ultimate ground for Marxian theory, as an ens realissimum. Ens realissimum. In a subsequent study, these premises are further refined. Within a systematic framework of, quote, metastructure and, quote, structure, a framework shaped by the ambition to reformulate political theory, a specific perspective on Marx's Capital is also embedded. The, quote, metastructure is intended to designate a general, at most analogous to terms such as regime, etc., and more abstract nexus that encompasses and transcends both society and the state. The quote structures, conversely, refer to class relations. This bears directly upon capitalist relations. Footnote. According to its own stated aim, this approach seeks to expand Marxian theory through an analysis of law and domination. See Jacques Bidet, Für eine allgemeine Theorie der modernen Gesellschaft, published in Dialektik, in German, 1992/1993. In this context, also the following works: Jacques Bidet, Que faire du capital, Théorie de la modernité, Paris, 1990, Demain le sur état, in the book Éthique et Politique, Actuel Marx, number 11, Actuel Marx being a journal in France. Pour un contractualisme révolutionnaire, published in Actuel Marx Confrontation, l'idée du socialisme a-t-elle un avenir, 1992, Paris. Théorie générale, théorie du droit, like right, I don't know how to say that word, D-R-O-E-T, T-R-O-I-T, théorie générale, théorie du droit, de l'économie et de la politique, Paris, 1999. Explication et reconstruction du capital, published in Paris, 2004. Die metastructurelle Reconstruction des Kapitals, in Jan Hofstadter's Das Kapital neu lesen, Beiträge zur radikalen Philosophie, Munster, 2006. The writings of the early Marx, specifically those dedicated to the critique of legal philosophy and the state, are ignored. The construction of the metastructure lies quite close to rational empiricism. See, as an exemplary instance of this position, Inge Elba's piece, Wertformenanalyse und Geld, zur Debatte über Popularisierung, Brüche und Versteckspiele in der Marxischen Darstellung, in Berliner Verein der Mega-Edition. Wissenschaftliche Mitteilungen, 2008. In Elba's work, too, there is a dichotomization into meta-theory and object theory, as a consequence of the reception of the approach of analytic philosophy. The Wittgensteinian dilemma remains undiscussed. See regarding Bidet's approach also Giorgio Cesarale, fra Marx et Althusser, la ricostruzione proposta da Jacques Bidet del passaggio marxiano dal mercato al capitale. End footnote. Footnote. It is thus conceived as a positive, structurally general entity. Footnote. Here, for the moment, abstraction is made from the quote superstructure. The concept of structure employed by Bidet is emancipated from that of Althusser. Quote, for Althusser, not only is the economic base a quote structure, but so are all forms of social practice, end quote. Jacques Bidet. Althusser argued uses, quote, structure as a, quote, epistemological metaphor, end quote, for the, quote, process without a subject, end quote. And that quote is from Tim Ebner and Jörg Novak's Struktur als Bruch. Alternativen zum autoritären Post-Althusserianismus by Badiou und Zizek. Structure as rupture. Alternatives to authoritarian post-Althusserianism in Badiou and Zizek, published in Das Argument, 2010. Insofar as Bidet distinguishes between structure and practices, Bidet resolves the Althusserian indeterminacy. End footnote. Back to the body. Since Marx, in his, quote, exposition of the capitalist mode of production, end quote, begins with a, quote, theoretical analysis of the commodity relation, end quote, Bidet, which constitutes the, quote, abstract systemic presupposition of capitalism, end quote, Bidet, and since it is evident, quote, that commodity relations produce capitalism, end quote, Bidet, it becomes necessary to complement this overly narrow perspective. Footnote. The status of the analysis of the value form remains unaddressed here. End footnote. It is precisely this function that the, quote, metastructure of modernity, end quote, is intended to fulfill. With regard to the spheres of the economy, society, and the state, further differentiations are introduced. Consequently, and specifically in relation to, quote, commodity exchange, and, quote, distinctions are drawn among the categories of, quote, interindividuality. So let me repeat that sentence. Consequently, and specifically in relation to, quote, commodity exchange, and, quote, parenthesis, sick, exclamation point, and parenthesis. Distinctions are drawn among the categories of, quote, interindividuality, centricity, and asociality, end quote. Bidet. If one proceeds as Marx does, and this is back to the body, if one proceeds as Marx does, from the premise of, quote, production founded upon exchange, end quote, Bidet, one must necessarily posit a central authority capable of guaranteeing the, quote, rules of exchange, end quote, Bidet. Such a central authority, however, can only be extra-economic in nature. This central authority must encompass the sphere of the state, for the, quote, interindividuality of commodity relations, end quote, cannot exist, quote, without a central power, end quote, Bidet. This also implies that the, quote, center constitutes itself, quote, not as a form of atomistically free forces, but always as a form of social forces, end quote, Jacques Bidet. The metastructure therefore develops, quote, necessarily within structures, that is, within specific class relations, end quote, Jacques Bidet. Quote, the system of modernity, end quote, is thus to be understood as a, quote, unity of metastructure and structures, end quote, Bidet, whereby the metastructure is to be conceived as the, quote, presupposed posited, end quote, of the structures. Footnote. This is a simple and at its core state-centric image of political economy. And footnote. Footnote. Here a state-centric social theory conceived in a neo-mercantilist vein begins to emerge. This state-centric social theory is distinguished from classical state theory solely by the construction of a superordinate, quote, general entity, end quote, that is simultaneously presupposed by capitalism and inherent to capitalism. End footnote. End footnote. In modernen Gesellschaften gebe es allgemeine, quote, Kontraktualität und Herrschaft. I don't know why I started reading. Sorry, I had the German translation picked up and I was spacing out. I just started reading them in the German. I don't know why I did that. Back to the body. In modern societies, there exists a quote. In modern societies, there exists a general quote contractuality and domination, end quote. That is, relations of law and power. Footnote. The relationship between classes is held to be subject to contract. This conception privileges a specific form, yet ignores the very presupposition upon which that form rests. The associations that emerge are likewise assigned to the sphere of contractuality. They are said to exert influence upon the, quote, central authority, which in turn wields, quote, law and power, end quote. A more comprehensive consideration of the role of law is absent at this juncture. See also a corresponding restriction elsewhere. Jacques Bidet, classe, parti, mouvement, classe, quote, race, sex, in the journal, published in the journal Actuel Marx, Paris 2009. Proceeding from the paradoxical relationship between class and party, reference is made to movements and to diversifications of the political realm, with the aim of loosening the close liaison between party and class. End footnote. According to Bidet, Marx's work lacks a consideration of central authority, let alone of the, quote, metastructure. If instead of following Marx and Marx's emphasis on commodity relations, one follows Max Weber, then, according to Bidet, quote, two principles of economic rationality, end quote, emerge: market and plan. Footnote. The dualism of state and society is here replaced by that of market and plan. With this dualism, however, the planning aspect of capitalist enterprise management, as emphasized by Weber, is ignored. And it seems like that's also, this is just my 2 cents, it seems like it's also accounted for in Marx. Check out the piece on bureaucratization by Press Chattopadhyay. Anyway, in footnote. These two principles, market and plan, stand in a complementary relationship to one another. Footnote, quote, the market as a contractual relationship between individuals, as an explicit relationship of non-dependence, (sic, exclamation point, in parentheses, appeals to a universalist principle, the positive expression of which can only be a centralist, parentheses, a tautist, or statist, in parentheses, contractual relationship that is open to the free unfolding of a substantive will, capable of shaping its goals and means according to a plan. The plan is a rational dispositif, presupposes in turn the consent of those participating in the planning, i.e. the non-subordination of the participants to its realization. End quote. Jacques Bidet. It remains an open question here as to who enters into contract with whom. Furthermore, the problem of legitimacy is tied to the administrative class, conceived as the aggregate of all those participating in the plan. In this form, the plan then becomes a principle of the state. End footnote. The metastructure is to be situated in relation to these principles. It is to be conceived as analogous to the status Marx assigns to the commodity relation. It serves as a foundational theorem, and thus as an abstract, posited, and self-generating, quote, systemic precondition, end quote, while simultaneously constituting a, quote, inter-individual, centralist, and associative politico-economic form, end quote. Jacques Bidet. The metastructure thus synthesizes state-centric and social forms with forms of association. Footnote. As such a unity, it is, at its very inception, sub-differentiated. It is intended to constitute the framework for the structural forms and variants of modernity. Footnote. It is within this context that capitalism, too, is to be situated. Here Bidet proceeds from the premise of the free worker, conceived as a free bourgeois subject capable of entering into contracts and associations. Footnote. In implicit alignment with Althusser's description of, quote, class struggle, it is stated, quote, the capitalist commodity and labor market, insofar as it incorporates statist central authority, serves as a sphere of action for associated social forces and is simultaneously a site of class struggle. End quote. Jacques Bidet. Here, too, the state remains diffusely defined. End footnote. The social struggles of the workers in this view revolve around reforms. Footnote. A merely technical definition of class struggle, one oriented solely toward increasing productivity, is subjected to criticism. End footnote. The, quote, power of the workers, end quote, is bound to their contractual capacity, that is, to their bourgeois rights. This context also entails an appeal to a, quote, general will, end quote, to politics, a dynamic that, elsewhere, has led socialist politics to pursue production planning. Footnote. Drawing implicitly on Milovan Žilas's thesis regarding bureaucratic rule under socialism, the observation is made that, even in that context, contractual relations have not vanished. Furthermore, it is noted that the, quote, fundamentally recognized freedom of the labor market, end quote, exists there as well. Leadership by the party is said to be, quote, intertwined with the functional character of that party within the framework of a unified and hierarchizing system of all-encompassing planning. End quote. Žilas. It is the party above all that renders, quote, mental homogeneity, end quote, possible. By drawing upon the politicist construct of, quote, ideological state apparatuses, end quote. This structure of the party state is not only characterized as being restricted to pre-bourgeois conditions, but its form as a, quote, private, quote, association, end quote, unquote, is also elevated in significance. Bidet recurs to Rousseau's concept of the, quote, formality of the juridical within the general will, thereby engaging with the problem of legitimacy, is argued that statist planning has provoked a return to the market. End footnote. Since the worker has, in this context, advanced to the status of a citizen, the specific perspective adopted regarding the concept of capital becomes the focal point of interest. In keeping with a rationalist interpretation of Marx, capital is understood not as a philosophical theory, but essentially as a, quote, social scientific theory, end quote, i.e. as a social scientific discourse. Footnote: the combination of dialectical Hegelianism, materialism, and Spinozism is said to have failed. Historical materialism, here Bidet follows Althusser's philosophy, is, Bidet argues, a non-dialectical materialism. End footnote. Marx's concepts are held to possess a dual connotation. Footnote: Marx's concepts, such as value or surplus value, are said to be doubly determined. Concepts like value or surplus value possess, quote, two sides, an economic side and a juridico-political side, end quote. Jacques Bidet, end footnote. The weakness of Marx's approach is attributed to his philosophy, specifically to his, quote, conceptual construction, end quote, i.e. together with his specific, quote, historicism. Since Marx employs a logical historical method, a point Bidet does not explicitly mention but tacitly assumes, this results in a, quote, conflation of logical conceptual development and historical narrative, end quote. Oh shit, where am I? Let me repeat that. The weakness of Marx's approach is attributed to his philosophy, specifically to his, quote, conceptual construction, end quote, i.e. together with his specific, quote, historicism. Since Marx employs a logical historical method, a point Bidet does not explicitly mention but tacitly assumes, this results in a, quote, conflation of logical conceptual development and historical narrative, end quote. Bidet. Footnote: Schumpeter had already adopted this disciplinary categorization of Marxian theory. Schumpeter's attempt to disaggregate Marxian theory into its constituent scientific parts, philosophy, economics, sociology, and history, finds its legitimation in rendering that theory compatible with bourgeois academia through a process of discipline-specific positivization, in which all critical elements have been extinguished. See Joseph Schumpeter, Kapitalismus, Sozialismus und Demokratie, published in Bern, 1950. Obviously, that's I believe that was published earlier in English. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Proceeding from this very ground, Bidet seeks to reconstruct a comprehensive theory that serves as a model for a socio-philosophical and sociological science of society. End footnote. In Marx's Capital, the reader is guided from an analysis of the commodity via an analysis of the, quote, capitalist structure to the, quote, general foundation of socialism and the end of the historical narrative, end quote. Bidet. Footnote: to this extent, Bidet adheres to a traditionalist self-conception. What is ignored here is the debate surrounding the philosophy of history and the status of history, or more precisely, the genetic method in Marx's work. See Diethard Behrens' edited volume Geschichtsphilosophie oder des Begreifen der Historizität. Philosophy of History or the Comprehension of Historicity, published in Freiburg 1997. See especially the contributions by Diethard Behrens, Christoph Lieber / Axel Otto, Thomas Seidel, and Michael Heinrich. See regarding the problem of the historical within the critique of political economy. Above all, Thomas Gehrig and Kornelia Hafner's Historisches über das Kaufmannskapital. Historical notes on merchant capital. End footnote. For Marx, Bidet argues, quote, failed to recognize that the market and organization constitute two distinct structural poles of the modern social form, end quote. Bidet. Footnote. In contrast to the limitations of the Marxian approach, Bidet's argumentation is intended to, quote, culminate in the elaboration of new concepts, such as the multitude, the world system, the anti-globalization movement, advocating for a, quote, other world, unquote, anti-modernité, and the emerging world state, end quote, Jacques Bidet. By anti-modernité, Bidet refers to the epoch characterized by the transcendence of nation-state borders and by international institutionalization within the apparatuses of a potentially supranational state. A corresponding view can be found in Hirsch. See the first part of this study. End footnote. Against the backdrop of these presuppositions, the analysis proceeds to an interpretation of Marx's Capital. Marx's Capital, Bidet argues, exhibits a three-step dialectic, quote, premise or metastructure, in parentheses, structure, practices, end quote, Bidet. Footnote, here the metastructure serves as a, quote, logical presupposition, end quote. It consists in the fact that the concept of value precedes that of surplus value. End footnote. Within this schema, the economic object appears at the, quote, beginning of Marx's Capital, unquote, as, quote, something general, end quote, something abstract. This, and in this respect, the figure of inversion is immediately followed, constitutes the metastructure. This metastructure is, however, linked to simple circulation. Footnote, the abstract presupposition consists, quote, in a society that is ultimately constituted by commodity producers, end quote, who, quote, in their exchange of commodities mutually recognize one another as free, equal, and rationally acting agents, end quote. Proudhon's argumentation extends just as far. End footnote. The capitalist structure then generalizes, quote, the commodity form metastructure, end quote, i.e., quote, the commodity form of production, end quote. Bidet. Footnote. Yet what is meant by the, quote, commodity form of production, end quote? Is this merely a flaw in the metaphor? End footnote. The class structure inverts, quote, freedom, equality, and rationality, end quote, into domination and exploitation. The class structure constitutes, quote, social reality as the specific form of, quote, modern society, end quote. Bidet. Footnote. On the one hand, Bidet seeks to articulate something regarding the, quote, ontological status of the metastructure, end quote, i.e. to inquire into its, quote, social mode of being, end quote. On the other hand, drawing upon Althusser, Bidet aims to point to the social roles and practices that reproduce the structure. This reproduction, he argues, is not, quote, uniform, for structure exhibits, quote, trans-intentional, and, quote, tendencies, thereby giving rise to a space of possibility, one, quote, open to revolutionary practices, and, quote, capable of modifying the metastructure of societies. If one interprets Bidet correctly, a reformist orientation thus cloaks itself in revolutionary guise. And footnote. The central question, however, remains, how does modern society transition from the, quote, predominance of the market, end quote, to socialism? Footnote. Here Bidet once again recurs to a historical interpretation of the economic realm. From the standpoint of this interpretation, it seems plausible that law appears explicitly only in relation to private property, a usage that has prevailed in private law since its codification in Roman times. This line of argumentation, which focuses specifically on property rights, is characteristic of the early modern period. See by way of example Reinhard Brandt's Eigentumstheorien von Grotius bis Kant. Theories of property from Grotius to Kant. And footnote. If, as Bidet suggests, there exists in Marx's Capital a, quote, central ambivalence, end quote, between a circular dialectical form and a linear materialist form, end quote, then this stems from, quote, a combination of the circular dialectic of the social form by the irreversible linearity of history, end quote. Bidet. So let me repeat that. If, as Bidet suggests, there exists in Marx's Capital a, quote, central ambivalence, quote, between a circular dialectical form and a linear materialist form, end quote, then this stems from, quote, a contamination of the circular dialectic of the social form by the irreversible linearity of history, end quote. For Marx, as is posited within the Leninist understanding of tradition, proceeds from the market only to arrive in the end at, quote, planned organization, end quote. Bidet. Footnote. Marx, Bidet argues, fails to recognize, quote, that the dialectical mode of presenting the structure, necessitates this bipolarity between market and organization, end quote, because he tends, quote, to ascribe a dialectical and thus teleological character to the course of history as such, end quote. Bidet. Thus, Bidet suggests Marx operates naively on two fronts. On the one hand, historically, by employing a linear conception of history, and on the other, theoretically, by attempting to dialecticize history itself. End footnote. Marx begins the first section of Capital with the, quote, commodity form of production as such, as the most general and, quote, abstract form of capitalism, end quote. Bidet. Footnote. The confusion evident among many interpreters of Marx, Bidet contends, stems from an ambiguity, quote, between the presupposed concepts, such as concrete and abstract labor, and those concepts specific to the commodity form, end quote. For instance, the concept of value. However, the first section of Marx's work is not concerned with simple commodity production or simple circulation, but rather with the presupposed abstract. Yet in this concept of the abstract, its internal differentiation has vanished, a fact Bidet overlooks. And footnote. Indeed, the very structure of Marx's Capital is said to be fundamentally flawed. Footnote. This is demonstrated inter alia. Fixated on the idea that cooperation appears only in section 4, for he views it as, quote, social coordination, end quote, as synonymous with the, quote, productive rationality of modernity, end quote, Bidet. It is evident here that the logical structure of Marx's Capital remains inaccessible to Bidet. End footnote. As is argued elsewhere, in contrast to the determination of form, there exists a, quote, immense collection of commodities, end quote. Yet there also exists the, quote, non-commodity, understood as the, quote, materializations of large organizations, end quote, such as those described by Foucault, schools, hospitals, and administrative bodies. Footnote. At this level, Bidet argues analogously to theorists of use value, which leads him to a further dualism. Footnote. The distinction between state and society is here erased in favor of a Weberian formalism, the structure of rationality. This also stems from Althusserian premises. And footnote. Economic rationality, given that wages are embedded within corporate hierarchies and the, quote, competitive order of the market, end quote, is held to emerge from a, quote, combinatorics of market and organizational logic, end quote. Footnote. Thus there exists, quote, a metastructural concept of the enterprise and of wage labor, end quote. Bidet. By this point, it has become evident that the generation of this metastructure owes the generation of this metastructure's self to a failure to grasp the specific nature of the bifurcation into state and society. It serves to mask this lack of clarity. End footnote. Back to the body. In this respect, the, quote, beginning must be expanded. Here, Bidet reverts to the ideology of simple commodity circulation. Footnote. The commodity form, Bidet argues, presupposes, quote, individuals who are to be regarded as acting freely, equally, and rationally, end quote, as well as the, quote, conclusion of a contract between free and rationally acting persons, end quote, Bidet. Only such individuals, Bidet claims, are in a, quote, position to reach a mutual understanding regarding the goals and means of their actions, end quote, Bidet. This bipolarity is held to be present in money as well as in the coordination of labor. Footnote. Money, Bidet asserts, is, quote, on the one hand a commodity and on the other a sign sanctioned by a power presupposed to be communal in nature, end quote. Bidet. By thus aggregating these qualities, Bidet attempts to sidestep the debate between metalism and nominalism, effectively positing both determinations of money simultaneously. End footnote. Footnote. The coordination of labor is conceived on the one hand as a, quote, consequence of capitalist ownership of the means of production, end quote, and on the other as a, quote, elementary characteristic of organization, end quote. Bidet. End footnote. Back to the body. This bipolarity is held to be present in money as well as in the coordination of labor. With this, we arrive at the metastructural trinity of market, organization, and state. Footnote. Quote, the metastructure encompasses both the market-based and organization-oriented conceptions of bourgeois society, and thereby simultaneously implies a third form, the state as the pure form of organization posited as communal, end quote, bidet. The fetishism of the state documented here, however, remains uncomprehended. End footnote. The, quote, transition from metastructure to structure, end quote, is held to correspond to the transition from the market to capital. Footnote. The market appears here as a precondition of capital. End footnote. At this juncture, wages are ascribed an initial function, a move that leads bidet back once again to the theorem of simple commodity circulation. Footnote. If Marx is said to have anticipated the, quote, ideological, quote, formula of capital, money commodity, money prime, end quote, then this anticipation is deemed unnecessary because the concept of wage labor can be, quote, developed directly from the initial concepts of Marx's capital, end quote, bidet. The element of equality enables the insight that, quote, the metastructural continuum, which encompasses the two aforementioned exchange formulas, constitutes a unified space, end quote, bidet, quote, containing the interindividual market relationship, the planned organizational relationship, as well as the relationship between the two, end quote, bidet. For the freedom of wage earners is in fact, quote, the freedom of exchanging commodity producers, end quote, within the context of, quote, broader social freedoms, end quote. For, quote, market and organization, end quote, are, quote, always alternatives, end quote, bidet. Here Rousseau's vision of society shines through. End footnote. Against this backdrop, the metastructure lays claim to a character of a higher order. Footnote, quote, the metastructure, the, quote, posited presupposition, end quote, of modernity, end quote, is not merely the, quote, common sense of modern society, but simultaneously a, quote, demand. A competition of claims exists here, quote, that metastructural contractual freedoms have already been realized and that they ought yet to be realized, end quote, bidet, in the sense of a, quote, legally and politically actionable claim, end quote, bidet, a point which points to the, quote, amphiboly of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, end quote, bidet. The metastructure is thus said to be, quote, the instance of the necessary justification of the rational intelligible, end quote, bidet. It is intended, though this is not stated quite so explicitly here, to serve as a positive theory of bourgeois society and the bourgeois state. End footnote. Since freedom and equality are regarded as inherent to it, bidet effectively detaches them from their historical context and ontologizes them. However, the market and organization are said to be embedded within the class structure. Footnote. Quote, the notion that we all act freely, equally, and rationally within society we have created exists always under conditions of an already existing hierarchy of competence, including its capacity to reproduce itself as such as a class relation, end quote, bidet. This point is reinforced. Quote, the egalitarian postulates of the mediating instances, end quote, of market and organization are linked, quote, to the position of these instances as modern principles for the constitution of classes, end quote, bidet. The metastructure therefore exists, quote, only under conditions of the modern class structure, end quote, and of exploitation. End footnote. Back to the body. From this starting point, we can proceed to an expansion of Marxian theory, which can be presented in a three-field schema: metastructure, structure/tendencies, and practices. Footnote. In the sphere of the metastructure, the, quote, debates of modern political philosophy, end quote, and the controversies regarding the, quote, foundations of economic theory, end quote, are situated. In the sphere of the structure, one finds the conceptual framework of, quote, a sociology of the modern class system, end quote, i.e., with respect to the ruling class, quote, property in the market, end quote, and, quote, competence in the organization, end quote. while the dominated class consists of three factions. 1. Peasants and artisans. 2. Manual and clerical workers. 3. Administrative staff and civil servants. End footnote. Back to the body. The metastructure is posited as comprising three parts: the market and inter-individual contractual relations, intellect and reason in relation to the constitutional state and organization, and the, quote, central contractual relationship, end quote. Bidet. The structure is posited as exhibiting a, quote, bipolarity of the ruling class, end quote, which is differentiated, 1, into the sphere of the market, comprising employers and shareholders, and 2, the sphere of organization, comprising A, managers and senior executives, as well as B, the exploited class, consisting of the petty bourgeoisie, manual laborers, white-collar employees, and civil servants. End footnote. Footnote. The schema suggests a proximity to empirical reality. End footnote. Back to the body. This schema is interpreted in terms of class mechanics as one that encompasses both property positions and competence positions. Integrated into this theoretical construct are modern bourgeois philosophy, a class theory oriented simultaneously toward early capitalism and modern capitalism, a diffusely assembled, quote, underclass, which most closely corresponds to the Rousseauian poupe. I don't know how to say that, say people in French. Wait, I think I have internet access. Let's see if I can find it. French to English. One second.
Peuple. Peuple.
Peuple?
Peuple.
Peuple? I don't know. That seems weird. Where's the sentence anyway? Integrated into this theoretical construct are modern bourgeois philosophy, a class theory oriented simultaneously toward early capitalism and modern capitalism, a diffusely assembled, quote, underclass, which most closely corresponds to a Rousseauian pouple, I don't know, and functionaries. For the dominated group, this gives rise to the possibility of forming alliances or engaging in, quote, organized struggle, end quote. Footnote. It is argued that a contradiction also exists between capital and the, quote, multitude. Here, Bidet appeals to the production of use values, a process described as, quote, unceasingly productive, end quote, which determines, quote, what in this sense possesses value, end quote. Bidet. Bidet here succumbs to the ideology of use value fetishism, which is a concept that's kind of associated with Kornelia Hafner, or at least there's an article titled Use Value Fetishism by Kornelia Hafner. For he posits a separation of the sphere of money and capital from the concrete world. End footnote. Political practice in the context of the, quote, struggle for political hegemony, end quote, is situated within a, quote, field of tension between three hegemonic positions, end quote. In this context, there exist two dominant positions, capital and organization. Footnote. Oh shit. I'm going to read that. In this context, there exist two dominant positions, capital and organization. Footnote. Quote, organized hegemony in capitalist society must prove its competence and legitimize its motives and principles, its goals and means, whereas, quote, unmediated capitalist hegemony is not required to render an account in the same manner, since its power rests upon the tacit legal titles of property, end quote. But who, one must object, at this juncture, sanctions these legal titles? Ultimately, this can only be the state. For Bidet, these two forms are intertwined and exist in a state of mutual presupposition. They remain, so the postulate goes, quote, nonetheless fundamentally antagonistic, end quote. Bidet, end footnote. Regarding the political struggle, a neo-Lassallean strategy is adopted, positing that one must invariably seek a, quote, alliance with the pole of competence, end quote. Bidet. The metastructure now assumes the status of a normative imperative. Capitalism is said to, quote, always contain both structure and system in the sense of a world system with a center and a periphery, end quote. Bidet, a formulation advanced in the tradition of Wallerstein and Samir Amin. Footnote, see above all the numerous works of Wallerstein, or Wallerstein. End footnote. However, the system is said to differ from the structure by virtue of the, quote, absence of a metastructure, end quote, i.e. by, quote, the lack of reference to a shared legal order, end quote. Footnote, quote, within the system, market-based mediation is not metastructurally linked to organizational mediation in the sense of a presupposed legal order, end quote. Bidet. End footnote. Consequently, it has been classified as a state of war, it being the system has been classified as a state of war. Footnote, this assertion holds true only in the specific context of Hobbes. Indirectly, this point also alludes to state socialism. End footnote. Back to the body. It is evident, so the conclusion drawn here, quote, that the structure offers the key to the analysis of the system, end quote. Bidet. The legal sphere, which had previously been introduced solely as the law of property, remains surreptitious in this regard. Footnote, on the one hand, it remains unclear to what extent private law is intended to play a role here. On the other, nothing is said regarding the significance of constitutional law and international law. The discussion of law remains rather vague and indeterminate. Moreover, it is overburdened with political social claims. Here, Bidet succumbs to legal fetishism. End footnote. Back to the body. Returning to our starting point, Bidet's construction of modern society. The following points are worth noting. The metastructure is said to generate, quote, class structures. Quote, modern society, end quote, is posited as the result of a, quote, reversal of a self-constituting principle, end quote. Bidet. Inasmuch as modern society develops, quote, in the form of an unfulfilled promise of a repressed pact, end quote. Bidet. Footnote. Here, the proximity to systemic self-reproduction, for instance, in Elba, in the piece Form Analyse und Geld, Form Analysis and Money, where value form analysis is understood as, quote, part of the explanation of a self-reproducing system, end quote. An approach that, without being theoretically grasped, perpetuated the fetishism of capital. End footnote. If exchange presupposes property, it does so only insofar as that property is recognized. Footnote. Quote, the exchange relation presupposes the reciprocal recognition of the other party's property. But the mutual recognition of property can only emerge from a, quote, contractual recognition of the general conditions of appropriation per se, end quote. Bidet. These conditions, though left unnamed here, are force and law. End footnote. Back to the body. The social contract, however, need not be confined within the bounds of capitalism. The social contract can remain open, for modern society possesses the capacity to set modern society's own rules. Footnote. In contrast to Kant, Bidet emphasizes that, quote, the central authority constituted by the social contract, quote, is capable of willing something other than, quote, the mere market relation, end quote. Here, an idealized image of the state is constructed, one, however, that can already be found in Rousseau. Bidet continues, quote, within the critical nexus between these two relations, the interindividual and the statist, modern society reveals itself not as a, quote, natural order governed by laws, whether of the market or of rational administration, but rather as an entity capable of setting its own rules, end quote. Bidet. Unlike Kant, this rule-setting competence is conceived not as merely formal, but as substantive. According to Bidet, revolutions arise from unfulfilled promises, a view that effectively dissolves politics into morality. It is the bourgeois horizon that here imposes its limits. End footnote. Contract theory presents two facets, the interindividual contract and the state contract, both of which are conceived as congruent within the framework of the social contract. Should these facets become autonomous, i.e. detached from one another, a state of generalized instrumentality ensues. Footnote. Thus, quote, the capitalist commodity ownership, end quote, strives to establish a, quote, central order, end quote, in order to, yeah.
There's chicken barbecue left over and coleslaw, rolls were on the, are in where the fruit juicer is for some reason.
Okay.
And it's a little bit chilly too.
Okay, cool. Where am I? Where the hell am I? Bidet continues, quote, within the critical nexus between these two relations, the interindividual and the statist, modern society reveals itself not as a, quote, natural order governed by laws, whether of the market or of rational administration, but rather as an entity capable of setting its own rules, end quote. Unlike in Kant, this rule-setting competence is conceived not as merely formal, but as substantive. According to Bidet, revolutions arise from unfulfilled promises, a view that effectively dissolves politics into morality. It is the bourgeois horizon that here imposes its limits. Footnote. End footnote. Sorry, I'm fucking up here. I guess just throw it off. Thus, quote, capitalist commodity ownership strives to establish a, quote, central order in order to enshrine, quote, the rules of exchange as natural law, unquote, while, quote, collective appropriation by the bureaucratic class, unquote, occupies the other side of this, quote, neutrality, that of administration subsumed under planning. End footnote. Footnote, quote, the instrumentality of the market opens up to the owner the possibility of using the full power of his property to impose contracts upon others, thereby exploiting others and accumulating wealth. The instrumentality of the plan unfolds, extending into infinity, a web that knows only ends and means, end quote. Bidet. As presented here, this appears in greater detail in Weber's work. It should not go unmentioned that the concept of exploitation employed here is a pre-capitalist one, exploitation through unequal contracts. And since I got thrown off, I'm going to reread the last sentence from the body. So back to the body. Contract theory presents two facets, the inter-individual contract and the state contract, both of which are conceived as congruent within the framework of the social contract, should these facets become autonomous, i.e. detached from one another. A state of generalized instrumentality ensues. Market and plan are simultaneously antinomous and complementary. Footnote, quote, the masters of the market are in a position to organize themselves, and the masters of the plan or of administration are capable of maneuvering within the mafia-like terrain of a political market, end quote, bidet. End footnote. Market and plan's antinomous structure can be resolved, or aufgehoben, only through, quote, association, that is by establishing a, quote, adequate relationship between market and plan. Yet association itself constitutes a, quote, moment of contractuality, end quote, bidet. Footnote, it is identified with self-administration and democracy. End footnote. This implies that this moment is situated, quote, within the framework of society as a whole, end quote, and integrated into the, quote, rational order, end quote, of market and plan. Footnote, beyond a, quote, certain scale, it exhibits the same polar forms, quote, as societal organization as a whole, end quote. For the associates, too, adhere to the division of labor and, quote, orient themselves according to the rules of exchange, end quote. Bidet. Here this implies that there is no alternative to the logic of capital. Regarding the debate on the logic of capital, the following remains highly instructive. Voy Fausto, sur le concept de capital, idée d'une logique dialectique, 1996. End footnote. The secret shared by the associated individuals, however, lies in the associated individuals' remembrance of the promise of unmediated discourse among all participants, undertaken with the specific intention of collective action. This line of thought leads us back to the realm of politics. Political theory, therefore, must orient itself in a broadly accessible manner toward, quote, transformative practice directed at demands, end quote, that, quote, could garner the assent of all contemporaries, end quote. Bidet. Footnote, this is clearly inspired by Rousseau, but how are opinions to be unified? End footnote. Disregarding the rupture in the argumentation, the inconsistency between the metastructural rationalism previously advanced and the Rousseauian perspective presented here, the conclusion drawn is that the task now at hand is to undertake a critique of all forms of domination. From this, as must be added here, and in alignment with the distributive theoretical perspective of, quote, crude communism, while incorporating utilitarian elements, the demand is to be raised that, quote, no distinction whatsoever, parenthesis, in power, wealth, income, etc., in parenthesis, can be tolerated unless it provides proof that it benefits those who have the least, end quote. Footnote, this, it is argued, constitutes the standpoint of the masses, end footnote. The genesis of the, quote, world state is accompanied by a transformation of the, quote, labor society, end quote, unquote. Bidet. Footnote, the emergence of a worldwide, quote, superstate, the, quote, emergence of a worldwide, quote, superstate, end quote, unquote, bidet, is deemed inevitable. This superstate exists as the, quote, structural, metastructural form that unifies human society in its entirety, end quote, bidet. Thus the world system comes into being accordingly. End footnote. Footnote, to the extent that the, quote, growth of productivity, end quote, becomes intertwined with environmental endangerment, labor, quote, tends to lose its, quote, dominant role, end quote. Bidet. For scientific labor as the, quote, most advanced form, end quote, of, quote, productive labor, end quote, tends to transcend the, quote, general matrix of rational organization, plan, market, end quote. Bidet. End footnote. Science moves to the forefront, quote, scientific activity, and, quote, generates, quote, a new type of subject of association, end quote, thereby marking the arrival of the, quote, postmodern era, a shift that also finds thematic expression in the ecological question, which gives rise to a new politics, one in which a morality exists that encompasses the law. And there's like a new section here. Carrying on. Both approaches, the functionalist system theoretical one and the rationalist one in its various guises, can be traced back genetically, whether explicitly or implicitly, to a neo-Cartesian materialist rationalism that gave it a modern form, the work of the Cercle de la Russie Neuve. Footnote, see the first part of this study. And that was like a group of like French intellectuals, kind of like directly or indirectly associated with the Communist Party. Like I think maybe Henri Lefebvre was in it, but maybe that was too early for him, I'm not sure. End footnote. In contrast to a materialist rationalism sliding into scientific dogmatism or a socially generalized hyper-rationalism, a Marxist empiricism appears as the more open form. A critique of rationalism can also be found, albeit in ascent form, in the work of Haug. Haug recognizes that relying on prescription within analytic philosophy entails the reproduction of, quote, relations of domination, end quote. Haug. Marx's, quote, paradigm, by contrast, aims in Haug's view at a, quote, synthesis of critique and positive science, end quote. Haug. Footnote, see Wolfgang Fritz Haug, Marx Ethik und ideologische Formbestimmtheit. Marx Ethics and Ideological Determination of Form. Published in Pluraler Marxismus 2, 1987. Haug wishes the concept of form to be understood as viewed in relation to the community. End footnote. However, the quote, end footnote. However, the, quote, positive science, end quote, referred to here is of a different nature than that of materialist rationalism. Marx's theory, it is argued, a theory of substantial, quote, Marx's theory, it is argued, is a theory of substantial empirical content. Thus, Marx's theory should be regarded as an empiricist discourse. Footnote. See Wolfgang Fritz Haug, Antisemitismus als Bewährungsprobe der Ideologietheorie, Antisemitism as a test case for ideology theory, published in Pluraler Marxismus 2. See also Haug's Die Frage nach der Konstitution des Subjekts, the question of the constitution of the subject. End footnote. In this context, recourse is frequently taken to Lenin, and an openness toward practice is asserted. Footnote. Quote, Lenin was a, quote, student from whom even his, quote, teacher, Marx could have learned a great deal, end quote. Haug. In Brecht's Beitrag zum Marxismus. Brecht's contribution to Marxism, published in Pluraler Marxismus 1. In accordance with this assumption, Gramsci is regarded as someone who undertook a, quote, re-accentuation, end quote, of Leninism upon its very foundations. Brecht, too, is considered to be a Leninist. Brecht is said to have provided, quote, the most serviceable version of materialist dialectics, end quote, with regard to the design of the relationship between practice and theory. Contrary to Haug's own apologia for Lenin, Haug elsewhere calls for practice and revolutionary democracy. See Wolfgang Fritz Haug, Marxismus, Dritte Welt und das Problem des Eurocentrismus. Marx the Third World and the Problem of Eurocentrism, published in Pluraler Marxismus 2. Brecht's turn, analogous to that of Hirsch toward analytic philosophy beginning in 1931, along with his contacts with Neurath, Carnap, and Frank, bore witness to a search for what might be considered materialism. End footnote. See Hans-Jürgen Rosenbauer's Brecht und der Behaviorismus, Brecht and Behaviorism, published in 1970. See also Jörg Wilhelm Just and Klaus Detlef Müller and Michael Voges, Bertolt Brecht, Epoche, Werk, Werkung. Brecht, Epoch, Work, Impact. Edited by Klaus Detlef Müller, Munich, 1985. Lutz Donneberg and Hans-Herald Müller, Wissenschaftliche Philosophie und literarischer Realismus. Scientific Philosophy and Literary Realism. Published in Edita Koch and Fritjof Trapp. Edited volume, Exil, Forschung, Erkenntnisse, Ergebnisse. Exile, Research, Insights, Results. Special Volume 1, Grieshelm, 1987. It is here too that Haug anchors his own concept of science. Regarding this position, see page 52 of some of the last mentioned thing. The issues of continuity and rupture with Aristotelian aesthetics, as well as modernism and neo-traditionalism within the context of Brecht's theory of action, are matters to be discussed elsewhere. Footnote. In this respect, a quote, technical Marxism also comes under criticism, though this critique is for the most part presented indirectly. See the critique of socialist cyberneticism found in Krzymanski. See Hans-Jürgen Krzymanski's High-Tech Antikapitalismus, ein Widerspruch in sich, High-Tech Anti-Capitalism, a contradiction in terms, and published in 2001, and Wolfgang Fritz Haug's Zur Dialektik des Antikapitalismus, on the dialectic of anti-capitalism, published in Das Argument, 2007. And footnote. Footnote. Regarding Brecht and Gramsci, it is noted that, quote, in the workshop of both, end quote, the atmosphere is, quote, experimental and utility-oriented, end quote. Implicit in this is presumably the notion that both were beholden to Baconian theory and thus to a bourgeois materialism. Unencumbered by blinders, Brecht and Gramsci absorbed the impulses of their time with boundless curiosity, drew upon Nietzsche, assimilated elements of pragmatism and behaviorism, and found inspiration in ideas ranging from logical empiricism to quantum mechanics and the special theory of relativity. In short, they adopted a gleefully eclectic and pre-theoretical stance. Such eclecticism, in turn, frolics within the marketplace of intellectual commodities. End footnote. Back to the body. Although Haug opposes morally generalizing judgments and advocates for the analysis of causal interconnections, Haug fails to provide a sound foundation for this approach through empiricism. Footnote. See Haug, Philosophie und sozialistische Länder im Widerspruch. Philosophy in Socialist Countries in Contradiction. Published in Pluraler Marxismus 2. End footnote. Back to the body. Although Haug opposes morally generalizing judgments and advocates for the analysis of causal interconnections, Haug fails to provide a sound foundation for this approach through empiricism. Above all, it becomes evident that the attempt to interpret Marx as an empiricist is unsuccessful. Two aspects of this line of argumentation require further clarification. A more precise definition of philosophy, and within that context, an explication of the concept of the ideological. Haug takes issue with a common conception of philosophy as a, quote, imaginary commonwealth, a, quote, well-ordered republic of the sciences, end quote. And with regard to antiquity, Haug focuses on the, quote, interface between the discourse of knowledge and the knowledge of discourse, end quote. Haug, which Haug argues points to political power, crisis, and the conduct of life among those subject to rule. Footnote. See Wolfgang Fritz Haug, Fragen zur Frage, Was ist Philosophie? Questions regarding the question, what is philosophy? Published in Das Argument 1990. Haug's polemic there is directed at the concepts of substance and reason. And footnote. Back to the body. It is here, as well as in the work of Aristotle, that Haug identifies the category of utility and usefulness. Haug contends that in opposition to the postulates of a generalized idealism, what truly matters is the practical dimension, a dimension that can only be advanced through critique. Philosophy is thus defined by the function that thought must, quote, first and foremost reclaim itself, end quote. Haug. Footnote. However, this critique applies in the first instance only to philosophy as a specific institution and form of social division of labor. A specification in the direction of imminent critique is to be found elsewhere. See Julia Koifisto, Kämpfte Philosophie, Marx, Labriola, Gramsci. Contested Philosophy, Marx, Labriola, Gramsci, published in Das Argument 1990. Here, however, the critical element is embedded within a very cursory account of the traditional historical trajectory of theoretical development, one in which the latter variant invariably presents itself as the more advanced stage. End footnote. Following Gramsci, Haug argues that the very notion of a generalized philosophy must be rejected. Philosophical practice, Haug insists, must involve a form of, quote, reading traces, end quote, a process that entails locating, quote, the downtrodden, end quote, and enabling the downtrodden to speak. This, for Haug, constitutes critique. Yet in doing so, Haug reverts to a moral postulate. At the same time, Haug remains at a loss as to how one might evade the problem of nominalism inherent in empiricism without falling back into the very critique of categories he has already rejected. For if one wishes to avoid such a regression, the very act of, quote, locating, of finding, presupposes the existence of entities that are already articulate and self-determining. How then is practice to be defined within such a starting point? Empiricist materialism, however, is to be articulated in more concrete terms as a positive science. Footnote. Kretke's understanding of Marx had, however, already been foreshadowed. See Michal Kretke's Das Marx-Engels Problem, Warum Engels das Marxische Kapital nicht verfälscht hat. The Marx-Engels Problem, Why Engels Did Not Falsify Marx's Capital, published in the Marx-Engels Jahrbuch, 2006. And critically regarding this, see Ingo Elba, Die Beharrlichkeit des Engelismus, Bemerkungen zum Marx-Engels-Problem, The Persistence of, quote, Engelsism, Remarks on the Marx-Engels Problem. In Marx-Engels Jahrbuch 2007. In certain respects, both authors are critical. In others, they remain committed to a traditional Marxism, one from which both nevertheless strive to distance themselves. Countering Kretke's dogmatically maintained thesis of the unity of Marx and Engels, Elba points to Engels' reflection theory and his, quote, occasionally crude empiricism, unquote. Elba. A second here. Sorry about that. Where am I? Where am I? And footnote. In this context, the transition to the realms of politics, economics, and history is of particular interest. In what follows, the transition will be demonstrated primarily through an examination of Kretke's position, the dual role of, quote, science and political theory, unquote, and owes its genesis to Engels and Kautsky, given that Marx regarded his own work as unfinished, and had himself referred to, quote, possible continuations, unquote. Okay, there's a number of footnotes here. There we go. See Michal R. Kretke, Marxismus als Sozialwissenschaft, Marxism as Social Science, published in 1996. In Wolfgang Vertaug and Michael R. Kretke's edited volume Materialien zum historisch-kritischen Wörterbuch des Marxismus, Materials for the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism, published in 1996. Subsequent citations refer to the Amsterdam edition. And footnote. Footnote. Nevertheless, Marx reportedly sought to, quote, revolutionize the science of political economy. See Michael R. Kretke, Kapitalismus, das Wort und seine Geschichte. Capitalism and the Word and its History, in Georg Fulbert and Michal R. Kretke's 9 Fragen zum Kapitalismus, 9 Questions on Capitalism, published in Berlin, 2007. Footnote. Kretke cites Marx's Capital. However, these passages refer specifically to the critique of political economy, not to Marxian theory in general, a distinction Kretke overlooks. End footnote. In this, it is thus evident that, as a consequence, subsequent completions were bound to occur. Footnote: in this context, Krtka refers, among others, to Otto Bauer. See Michael Krtka, Otto Bauer, 1881-1938, Die Mühen des Dritten Weges. Otto Bauer, 1881-1938, The Labors of the Third Way, published in Zeitschrift für Sozialistische Politik und Wirtschaft, Journal for Socialist Politics and Economics, 1997. Sternberg's work is adopted uncritically, while Korsch is interpreted as a, quote, complementarist, end quote, who supposedly conceived a new, politically expedient theory. Here, Krtka uncritically follows Perry Anderson's account and refers to Robert Michel's Geschichte des Marxismus in Italien, 1907, and to Predrag Vriniski, Geschichte des Marxismus, 1961/1971, 2 volumes, published in Frankfurt, 1972, and footnote. In this respect, there can be no, quote, return to Marx, end quote, for such an option denies the progress achieved within Marxism. Footnote: in this context, I already said that. Oh, no, I didn't. Where am I? I think I already read that footnote. However important the reference to the history of Marxism may be in principle, the conclusion drawn here is equally problematic. That the prescription against a, quote, return to Marx, end quote, does not stem from methodological grounds is evident in Kretke's work. Indeed, it serves to mask his own dogmatism, a dogmatism Kretke ties specifically to Austro-Marxism. A more enlightened approach would have been to demonstrate that any given, quote, return to Marx, end quote, is invariably indebted to a specific perspective constituting an integral part of a new theoretical approach. Kretke, however, emphasizes that decisive impulses for Marxist debate have originated from external sources, specifically from Keynes and Sraffa. Footnote: at the same time, Kretke asserts that the Institute for Social Research was, quote, refounded as at a distinct remove from the organizations of the labor movement, end quote. Kretke: Marxism after 1945, Kretke suggests, was then merely the work of a handful of survivors within an academic framework. Reference is made to Abendroth, Koffler, Lefebvre, and de la Volpe. End footnote. Back to the body. Marx's body of work, it is argued, has today been rendered relative. The assertion is substantiated, inter alia, by the argument that Marxian theory is fundamentally an empirical theory. Consequently, given that social and economic conditions have undergone transformation, Marxian theory itself is necessarily affected by these changes. Drawing upon the insights of Otto Bauer, the various crises confronting Marxism are interpreted as necessary adaptations to new prevailing conditions. Footnote: however, the proof which would have to be furnished beyond this assertion would then lie in demonstrating empirical factors of this transformation, all of which would necessarily alter the core of Marx's theory. Sin contradicts this view with regard to the relationship between science and philosophy. Quote, the dualism of interpretation corresponds to the fact that this opus can be understood as economic theory sensu stricto and was indeed formally conceived as such by Marx. Yet in Capital, the economic aspect is simultaneously viewed through sociological, anthropological, historical, philosophical, and political lenses. While this is entirely adequate to empirical reality and the factual dimensions of the economy, It runs counter to the division of academic social science into distinct disciplines, end quote. Karl Georg Sinn, Das Kapital und die politische Ökonomie des 20. Jahrhunderts, Capital and the Political Economy of the 20th Century. It must be noted that Sinn, too, operates within an undefined concept of empiricism, one incapable of adequately conveying Marx's conceptual framework, and thus he states, quote, Marx's philosophical terminology, which he applied to, quote, essential phenomena, end quote, has contributed to considerable confusion and diversion, end quote. End footnote. Marx's, quote, general laws were not, it is maintained, quote, formulated as quasi-natural laws modeled after the principles of social physics, or more precisely, social mechanics, end quote. Let me repeat that again. Marx's, quote, general laws were not, as maintained, quote, formulated as quasi-natural laws modeled after the premises of social physics, parenthesis, or more precisely, social mechanics, end parenthesis, end quote. Inasmuch as Marx theoretically incorporates within his framework the, quote, world of appearance, of will, and of representation, end quote. Elsewhere, Kretke refers directly to Otto Bauer as one of the most important representatives of Austro-Marxism. Highlighted in this context is the Austro-Marxist division of scientific labor, their demarcation from, quote, vulgar Marxism, and, quote, parenthesis, Kautsky, Lenin, and parenthesis, and their emphasis on Marxism as an empirical social science. According to Kretke, one finds in Otto Bauer a further differentiation: Marxism as an empirical social science and as a political science. Marx's, quote, new science is described as, quote, an empirical, exact, causal, mathematical, law-governed science of social life, end quote. In his political science, Bauer focuses on democracy and nationalism. The nation is conceived as a social form that shapes individuals, while national hatred is viewed as merely transformed class hatred. Bauer understands democracy on the one hand as a necessary element of capitalist development. On the other, Bauer upholds parliament and bourgeois rights as the starting point for a, quote, economic democracy, end quote. This concept is intended to incorporate a strategy of socialization and serve as a precursor to market socialism. Sorry, there's a number of footnotes that I have to read here. Footnote. Otto Bauer is presented as the figure who, quote, embodied a political alternative of democratic socialism vis-a-vis both communism and reformism, end quote. Kretke. On Bauer see Detlef Alber's Versuch über Otto Bauer und Antonio Gramsci zur politischen Theorie des Marxismus, an essay on Otto Bauer and Antonio Gramsci on the political theory of Marxism, published in 1983, and the edited volume, Otto Bauer und der Dritte Weg, die Wiederentdeckung des Austromarxismus durch Sozialismus und Eurokommunisten. Otto Bauer in the, quote, Third Way, The Rediscovery of Austro-Marxism by Left Socialists and Eurocommunists, published in Frankfurt, 1979. Volker Granzov and Michal R. Kretke, Thesen zur politischen Theorie des Austro-Marxismus. Theses on the Political Theory of Austro-Marxism in Arbeitskreis Westeuropäischer Arbeiterbewegung. In the edited volume, Eurokommunismus und marxistische Theorie und Politik. Eurocommunism and the Marxist Theory of Politics. See Richard Kende, Otto Bauer, Person und Politik, 1881 to 1938. Otto Bauer, Person and Politics, 1881 to 1938, published in Leviathan, 1989. Peter Kuhlemann, Am Beispiel des Austro-Marxismus, Sozialdemokratische Arbeiterbewegung in Österreich von Heinfeld bis zur Dollfuss-Diktatur. Using Austro-Marxism as an example, the Social Democratic Workers' Movement in Austria from Heinfeld to the Dollfuss dictatorship, published in 1979. Norbert Lesser's Zwischen Reformismus und Bolschewismus, der Austro-Marxismus als Theorie und Praxis. Between Reformism and Bolshevism, Austro-Marxism as Theory and Practice. Published in Vienna, 1968. See Gerhard Storm, Franz Walter, Weimarer Linkssozialismus und Austro-Marxismus, historische Vorbilder für einen dritten Weg zum Sozialismus. Weimar Left Socialism and Austro-Marxism, Historical Models for a, quote, Third Way to Socialism, published in Berlin, 1984. In this work, Kretke presents Bauer's biography accompanied by several eulogies. End footnote. Footnote. Bauer is known for having repeatedly pointed to the nationalities question as a potential explosive charge for the Habsburg Empire and, contrary to Engels, to the awakening of the, quote, peoples without history, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Fascist movements are said to be, quote, an expression of the weakness of bourgeois hegemony, end quote. Bauer. Footnote. Kretke overlooks Hinz's insight that parliaments belong, quote, to the apparatus of state power, end quote. See Otto Hinz's Wesen und Wandlung des modernen Staates in Gesammelte Abhandlungen, published in 1962. And footnote. Footnote. The industries slated for nationalization are to be managed by democratically elected administrative boards. These boards are to comprise representatives of the state, the producers, the consumers, supported by democratically self-managed banks. For a critique of concepts of economic democracy, see Diethard Behrens, Elemente einer Demokratie Theory, Elements of Democratic Theory. Quote, socialism can today be defined as the completion of the French Revolution, which stalked halfway, end quote. And it quotes from Arnold Künzli, keine Zukunft ohne politische Demokratie und Wirtschaftsdemokratie in Widerspruch, I can't pronounce that. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Anyway, Yet this constitutes socialism confined in the limits of the ideals of the bourgeois republic, or alternatively, Rousseau supplemented by economic democracy. Okay, back to the body. Gegenüber der aktuellen. Sorry from the German. With regard to the current situation, Kretka points to the symbiosis between capitalism and democracy. A symbiosis that, in Kretka's view, necessitates political economy as both a political and social science. The objective, he argues, is a return, quote, to the rich tradition of, quote, reformist socialism, end quote, Kretka, specifically to the, quote, political economy of socialisms, end quote, Kretka. Footnote. Quote, more market, more capitalist private production within the context of the historical symbiosis between capitalism and democracy always implies more state as well, end quote. I believe that's Kretka. From this premise, a specific constitution of political economy is to be derived, and the, quote, traditional division of labor between economists and sociologists, parenthesis, or political scientists, in parenthesis, end quote, is to be abolished. Michał R. Kretka Michał R. Kretka, Marxismus als Sozialwissenschaft, Marxism as social science. Here the regulation school is simultaneously praised and critiqued. In particular, Michel Aglietta, Régulation et crise du capitalisme, published in 1982, or originally in 1976. Robert Boyer, La théorie de la régulation, une analyse critique. He's been commended for addressing key issues such as the mediation between the theory and history of capitalism. At the same time, however, Kretka identifies the limitations of the regulation school, specifically regarding the regulation school's counter-movement against social scientific functionalism. Insofar as the regulation school is conceptually deficient, he argues, it also lacks a proper concept of history, and thus regresses into a simplistic form of, quote, historicism. Where am I? However, it's back to the body. However, Marxism, conceived as an empiricism, as a political and economic science, also points to another aspect, a non-empirical one. In the work of Haug, for instance, this aspect manifests as the realm of the ideological. Quote, the ideological is discussed within the context of Engels' concept of, quote, ideological power, end quote, a concept that seeks to understand the state as a social and indeed, quote, ideological power, end quote. As a state, footnote, the ideological is to be understood as, quote, a modification and specific organizational form of the, quote, ensemble of social relations, end quote, and the individual's participation in the control of these relations, end quote. Kretka. It constitutes a, quote, external arrangement within social relations, end quote. Footnote. The state is regarded as a, quote, alienated social power, end quote, as a, quote, social power over society, end quote, and as a, quote, ideological power. End footnote. Back to the body. As a state, This ideological power is said to be armored by an apparatus of force. This state ideological power constitutes, quote, socialization from above, and, quote, and represents a class society. Marx, it is argued, sought to conceive of the state, quote, as alienated commonality, end quote. Haug, quote, as an illusory community, end quote. Haug. Gramsci, by contrast, conceives of the state as an integral entity, specifically as an apparatus of coercion combined with hegemony. Footnote, thus for Haug, the political determines the social. In Haug's work, the realm of the social now appears further differentiated. Distinctions are drawn between specific social functions, quote, proto-ideological material, quote, serving as the foundation of the ideological, quote, the ideological itself, and the, quote, cultural dimension, end quote. Haug. Footnote, within the conceptual horizon of functionalist materialism, a classification is established, quote, the ideological, quote, the cultural, and, quote, commodity aesthetics, quote, do not designate essential characteristics of the material, but rather the material's organization, the way the material integrates the material into a specific context of effects, quote. Haug. In this context, only the, quote, cohesion organized from above, end quote, is considered ideological. Furthermore, there is said to be an ideological value, but in the hierarchization of the state form ideological and its dependent moments, what constitutes the apex under capitalism? End footnote. These ideological powers, it is argued, organize the experience of social relations, including a, quote, aggressive silence regarding capitalist class relations, end quote. Haug. Thus, quote, the ideological, end quote, is characterized as a state-like, quote, fundamental structure of alienated socialization from above, end quote. Haug. Quote, ideologies, conversely, are to be understood as, quote, complex practical norms, end quote. Haug. Charged with the regulation of, quote, functional socialization, end quote. Haug. Footnote. With this, a specific subjectivation has been effected on the basis of a class mechanism. Although Engels identifies law as the second ideological power, Haug regards law as state-induced, and from the perspective of class theory, contested terrain. End footnote. Back to the body. Consequently, the task of integrating society is foisted upon the ideational political sphere. Quote, the ideological serves to hold the social whole together by reproducing class antagonisms and class domination, a process effected through the formation of ideological compromises within a hierarchical arrangement structured, quote, from above to below, end quote, end quote. Haug. In drawing upon a simple metaphor derived from the realm of religion, the text states, quote, ideological powers become and remain powers only insofar as they appropriate functions that are socially necessary for the whole of society and perform those functions in their own specific manner, end quote. The literature itself, however, is said not to be ideological. Only the literary establishment is, end footnote. The entities, state law, politics, etc., which appear here as metaphysical abstractions, inevitably figure as quasi-subjects, as agents of priestly deception. Haug then proceeds to construct institutions as, quote, ideological estates, end quote. These define the forms of interaction. It is noteworthy that those with higher qualifications end up in the category of, quote, ideologues. It appears that a simple schema of mental versus manual labor is being reproduced here. In contrast, Marx speaks of a, quote, state caste, end quote. The ideological system, it is argued, functions flexibly thanks to a division of labor among morality, politics, and science. Science, however, operating on the basis of direct communication, behaves in this context in a, quote, anti-ideological, end quote, and anti-authoritarian manner. Its ideological character, it is postulated, following Althusser, lies solely in its separation from the sphere of production. Footnote. Quote, the scientific process is, at the scientific process's core, the labor-based production of knowledge, knowledge regarding whose rules and results there is communication, and which remains the subject of interminable controversy. By its very nature, the core structure is anti-ideological, end quote. Haug. This passage calls to mind similar points made by Popper regarding the term, quote, core structure, end quote. See also the argumentation in Becker. End footnote. Footnote. See Louis Althusser's Philosophie und spontane Philosophie der Wissenschaft. Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Sciences, translated into German in 1985. End footnote. The state-centric ideological formation emerging here, however, subordinates the social realm to the state just as surely as it fails to adequately conceptualize the state itself within the context of capitalism. A reflection on the category of, quote, state fetishism, on the distinct sphere of the state as a separate element of bourgeois capitalist society, would certainly have offered a more fruitful path here. What is evident, however, is that the specific construction of the, quote, ideological, end quote, undertaken here effectively blocks access to any meaningful understanding of what, quote, materialism meant to signify. Let us return here to the question of Western Marxism. For Wolfgang Fritz Haug, the starting point is the call for a, quote, historicization of Marxist theory, end quote, and practice. Various strands of theory building constitute the moments of a development which, in the course of its turn back toward Marxism, has positioned itself against two theoretical practical stances, critical theory and, quote, GDR Marxism, end quote. Within this framework, Wolfgang Fritz Haug also engages critically with Perry Anderson's Western Marxism, the book. The central shortcoming of Anderson's work, Haug emphasizes, is that Anderson conceives of, quote, intellectual history as a history of opinions, end quote, an approach that leads him to schematism and superficiality. Footnote. There's a number of footnotes here. This presupposes a certain knowledge of the history of the labor movement, as well as a capacity for self-reflection on the part of intellectuals. Quote, and we require an analysis of the structural problems inherent in the mutual alliance, an alliance necessary for workers as well as for growing segments of the intellectual class, as well as a historical understanding of the structural conflicts within this alliance, end quote. Wolfgang Fritz Haug, in a piece titled Westlicher Marxismus, Western Marxism, published in Pluraler Marxismus II, is noteworthy here that workers and intellectuals appear to be treated as fixed entities. End footnote. Footnote, the milestones of this development are said to have been Sartre, Lukács, the Algerian Revolution, and the student movement, through his own turn backward, a process of, quote, retraditionalization, end quote. Haug claims to have left critical theory behind him. A reference to Althusser is conspicuously absent here. In this context, one also finds in Fritz Haug's work a cautious distancing from Anderson's rather heavy-handed typification. End footnote. Back to the body. The concept of, quote, Western Marxism, Haug argues, is ill-suited for a reformulation of Marxism, as it is bound up with, quote, Hegelinizing patterns, end quote, and a, quote, spontaneous Eurocentrism, end quote. The imperative now, Haug contends, is to act in the spirit of a, quote, mondialization of Marxism. Footnote. The debate, however, remains characterized by ambivalences. On the one hand, Anderson is credited with providing descriptions that contain substantive content, including A, the demonstration of the foundations of Western Marxism in Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci, B, the identification of its principal representatives, Adorno, Althusser, Coletti, Benjamin, Goldman, Horkheimer, Lefebvre, Marcuse, Sartre, and de la Volpe, and Y, the characterization of Western Marxism as provincial. On the other hand, Anderson is reproached for a lack of insight. Quote, Anderson scarcely perceives that, within the arena of methodological disputes, these theorists are, each in their own way, waging the struggle over the political line. End quote. Haug. Footnote, see Haug Preface, or how this book got its title, in Pluraler Marxismus, Volume 1. Footnote, see, as formulated following Lefebvre, see Henri Lefebvre, une pensée devenue monde fait il abandonner Marx, a thought that became a world. Should we abandon Marx? Published in 1980, Paris. A, quote, ecumenism of Marxism is the preferred approach, yet how in this context is one to avoid falling into an Andersonian-style history of opinions? End footnote. Back to the body. A peculiar feature of Haug's reflections is that they carefully allied the fact that, quote, Western Marxism, end quote, is in essence an expression of dissidence. In Anderson's work, this dissonant character had already been attenuated through a classification based on geography, intellectual milieu, and philosophy. Anderson's apparent openness to the various forms of Marxism merely serves to mask the fact that here, too, a selection has already been made, specifically a selection in favor of a new traditionalism. Western Marxism, however, is generally regarded as a, quote, underground Marxism that aims at the latent context of Marx's critique of society. The term, quote, Western Marxism is itself the expression of a historical reflection and originates with Merleau-Ponty. A specific epistemological dimension is claimed as its defining quality, reflexivity, a quality that is, not least, responsible for the fact that, to Western Marxism, Marxian theory can appear as a critical revolutionary theory of social practice. Footnote, see Georges Labica, Marxism-Leninism, Elements of a Critique. See Merleau-Ponty, Die Abentur der Dialektik, The Adventures of the Dialectic, originally published in 1955. Footnote, Footnote, see Karl Korsch, The Current State of the Problem, Marxism and Philosophy. At the same time, an anti-critique, available in the Korsch's collected works. And footnote. Footnote is from this standpoint, too, that the great significance of ideology critique is determined for Haug, a significance whose substance Haug has systematically failed to recognize because the undifferentiating linguistic usage of structuralism stands in the way. And footnote. Thus far, it has been possible to identify certain defining characteristics suggesting that, in many fields, a debate is being waged over a theory presumed to be significant for understanding Marx's analysis and critique. This debate is therefore conducted across the following domains: epistemology, philosophy, science, politics, history, the social sphere, economics, and cultural phenomena. It remains, therefore, to be examined to what extent a coherent thread of thought can be reconstructed within Western Marxism, or conversely, how it itself lives up to its own claim to conceptualize society in all its various spheres. Yet, and here the question still lingers, what precisely is Western Marxism? End quote. Okay, that's the end. Thanks for listening.